Thank you so much, Xander, and thanks to you and the Forest Stewards Guild for inviting us to present about the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network today. We really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for joining and sharing your time with us to learn more about what we're doing with Ask. Does the screen look okay? Quick thumbs up. Awesome. So this effort, we have over 200 collaborators, and that number is growing of folks who are really involved and engaged in this project. And so the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network, this presentation today is really going to focus on 10 years of findings that we have and really starting to think about what trends are we learning from the adaptation strategies that are being implemented on the ground as a part of this network. And it really evolved because there was a need for an experimentally robust and an operationally feasible examples of implementing climate adaptive strategies in these different forest ecosystems across the US and Canada. And so that's what we'll be sharing with you today. This paper is published in Bioscience. It's the Nagel et al. 2025 paper, 10 Years of Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change. So we can throw the links to that in the chat as well if anyone's interested in learning more. But this is our long list of authors. And of course, these are just a snapshot of folks who are involved in this network. But you'll be hearing from myself, Linda Nagel, Maria Vicini, and Maria Genoviak today as we go along. A quick outline for what we'll cover today. We're going to start out with why think about silviculture when it comes to considering climate adaptation. Then we'll dive into what is the Ask Network, how has it evolved over the last 10 years, and where are we going? Talk about some of our adaptation treatment trends that we're finding, and then lessons learned and future directions for the network. So with that, I will hand it off to Linda.
Thank you, Courtney, and thanks for inviting us to come in and give this presentation. I see some names from various roles that I've played over the years, and so I just want to say hello to everybody, and we're really delighted to be here, able to share about this project. So I'm going to kick us off by talking just a little bit about silviculture. I love silviculture. I'm trained as a silviculturist, and it really is central to the work that we're doing here with the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project. But the reason we wanted to just pause and talk about silviculture as an entry point into the project is because it is a really old discipline. It's older than the discipline of ecology, and it has evolved greatly over time. And it has proven itself to be a discipline that can adapt and has been highly adaptable to changing conditions, including societal expectations of forests, economic and ecological drivers of change. And there has been a pretty common definition of silviculture for a long period of time. And there have been some papers published recently by some thought leaders in this area that have really looked at silviculture as an evolving discipline. And the Putman et al. Paper in the Journal of Forestry from 2025 has a definition that we really like and is pretty central to how we've been applying it in this project. The art and science of supporting and stewarding forest and woodland ecosystems and their ability to adapt in order to foster the diverse values of forests, contributions to people, including landowners, rights holders, communities, and society. And so that's from a paper by the title Silviculture, More Complex Than Ever. And it really also sort of highlights, this paper highlights that silviculture really is the toolbox for carrying out all types of forest management and adaptation work, everything from preparation of the site to planting to harvesting trees. And again, for managing for all those different types of objectives that we have, including things like restoring habitat and productivity and other ecological attributes. Inherent to silviculture also is the development of desired future conditions, which we have spent a lot of time thinking about with this work here, because it also really is important for determining where do we want to go in the future and how do we craft a desired future condition that allows us to meet the articulated management objectives for a given landowner. And then finally, silviculture is also inherently iterative. So the lessons of the past inform refining decisions for the future. There's a feedback loop where we implement treatments, we measure, monitor, and then we adjust. We adjust throughout that entire process. So it's a very complex discipline. So when we think about climate adaptive silviculture, in our paper, we talk about these three areas in particular, changing habitat suitability and considerations for tree species and thinking about things like what species are projected to do well in the future, which species that might be growing on a site are projected to not do so well. And so there's a lot of tools that are out there now that can be utilized to help guide decisions in the realm of forest assisted migration or just various considerations with genetics and seed sourcing. The second one, changing threats. We were just talking about this before we started the webinar, just all the different forces on our forests that and our natural resources in general that are changing, driven by drought, driven by changes in temperature, and how those threats connect to what our desired future conditions might be. And that's also caused us to sort of stop and reflect on how we are looking forward versus how we might have been looking to historic conditions in the past to what might be growing into the future. And then changing societal expectations, which you're all very aware of how society has viewed natural resources and viewed forestry over time. And so central to success of forest management is just understanding how those changing expectations work within our ability to utilize adaptive management to meet those objectives. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Courtney, and she's going to lead us through some climate adaptation concepts. Thanks.
Awesome. So as Linda mentioned, inherent to silviculture is coming up and thinking about what we want our desired future conditions to be. So these are those pictures in our head of what we want our forest to look like in 5, 10, 50, or 100 years. And so with the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network, or ASC, we are intentionally thinking about what is the current condition and what do we want that desired future condition for these forest ecosystems to look like into the future. However, we know that climate change pulls those desired future conditions in an uncertain trajectory. And so what we're really trying to think about is how do we respond to those uncertain future conditions and still implement adaptation strategies that help us achieve those desired future conditions, goals and management objectives and values that we want under a changing climate into the future over both the short and the long term. And so the big question that we're trying to address with the ASC network are really what actions can be taken to enhance the ability of a system to cope with change and still help us meet our goals and objectives. And how are we creating these really robust, thought out, intentional plans to help us get there and really providing that rationale, connecting the dots between those goals and objectives to those climate impacts to what we're ultimately implementing on the ground and determining if they're successful or not. And so we do this through the ASC network by really using the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS's adaptation workbook framework, and using that as a way to introduce managers to some of the different tools and approaches that help integrate climate change into silvicultural decision making to achieve those goals and objectives, and also co-developing these robust operational examples of how to integrate climate adaptation into silviculture through on-the-ground actions. And so we're really providing this venue where we're bringing together managers and scientists to the table to have this conversation of what are the climate impacts going to be? How are they going to influence our management goals and objectives for these different forest ecosystem types? And how are we going to address that through different silvicultural actions and prescriptions that we're implementing on the ground across a spectrum of adaptation options or responses? And so we're really providing those examples on the ground through these silvicultural demonstrations that are a part of this large-scale experiment. And so we now have 14 sites across the US and Canada. You can see where they all are located across this map here. As I mentioned, each site really is championed by people like Christopher Riley, who's on this call, and others who are those key leads, both from the research perspective and from the management perspective, who are making sure that these sites are implementable and that we can continue to sustain them into the future, at least 20 years, since this is a climate change experiment. And so it really is this commitment to this long-term research project to really test how are our different adaptation actions and silvicultural strategies responding to climate change across this network of 14 sites and all of these different forest ecosystem types. And so each Ask site really is co-produced, and we start with this collaborative workshop process. So as I mentioned, we utilize the NIACS adaptation workbook framework, and this really is helpful for grounding us in what do you value about these forest ecosystems, how is climate change going to impact those values, and how do we implement those adaptation actions to continue to achieve those DFCs and those values into the future and monitor their success. And so we come together at this workshop with managers and researchers and community members to really determine what do we want different adaptation actions to look like for each of these Ask sites. And I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but we're explicitly thinking about what do we want desired future conditions to be for resistance versus resilience versus transition. And so we're really coming up with that set of climate adaptive strategies and silvicultural prescriptions for each of those adaptation options. And so, to go into a little bit more detail, again, one of the central components of this experiment is that we are testing the spectrum of adaptation options across how do we maintain what's currently on the ground to really thinking about how are we being forward-looking and promoting change. And so with resistance, these are really those actions that help improve the defenses of the forest against anticipated change or directly defend the forest against disturbance to maintain those relatively unchanged conditions. So we're really thinking about how do we want to maintain those things of high value and maintain that current species composition and a similar structure in the face of a changing climate. With resilience, those are those actions that accommodate some degree of change, but encourage a return to a prior condition or desired reference condition after those disturbances occur. So this is our rubber band adaptation option, where the system is experiencing those disturbances, but able to quickly bounce back or return to that desired reference condition after those disturbances occur. And a lot of this might include increasing some heterogeneity in both biodiversity, species diversity, and structure. Then with transition, we are intentionally accommodating change and enabling ecosystems to respond to those new and changing conditions. And so even though the system might look completely different in terms of what that desired future condition is on the ground, we're still achieving those key goals and objectives and values and ecosystem services that we want under a changing climate into the future by intentionally accommodating that change through what we're implementing on the ground. And then finally, given that climate change impacts all forests globally, we also have a no action that kind of serves as a control that allows the systems to respond to climate change in the absence of direct silvicultural intervention and serve as that baseline for comparison to resistance, resilience, and transition and what we're implementing on the ground. Here we go. So Ask really does provide this framework for comparing the ability of these different adaptation options to achieve those desired future conditions. And so it's really the strength of this framework is we have a consistent starting point as what is the starting condition across all of these different forests, knowing that they all have different forest types, they are experiencing different disturbance regimes. They have different management contexts that they're dealing with. So we can really consider what is the starting condition of the forests that are a part of the ASC network. And then how are we explicitly coming up with what we want for the desired future conditions to be for resistance versus resilience versus transition, and really starting to think about how are each of these adaptation options effective and really achieving those desired future conditions as we are experiencing climate change impacts into the future. And what is that range of acceptable outcomes for those desired future conditions as we move forward? And so that's one of the large strengths of the ASC network, is that we are explicitly testing those resistance, resilience, and transition strategies across this spectrum. And then just briefly, this is our study design. And so we really, again, we come together. Each site is co-produced at that collaborative workshop where we bring together everyone to come up with what we want the desired future conditions to be for resistance, resilience, transition, and then that no action control. We want to make sure we're achieving those key management objectives across resistance, resilience, and transition. And each of those then has their own suite of silvicultural tactics to achieve those desired future conditions. And so some of the consistent study design elements across all 14 sites is the replication. So it's an experiment. It needs to be statistically robust. So each treatment is replicated 4 times. So for resistance, for resilience, for transition, for no action. We also wanted this to be operationally feasible. And so the stand or experimental unit size is about 10 hectares or 20 to 25 acres for a total of 400 to 500 acres or 100 hectares total for each ASC site. The affiliate sites are a little bit smaller. And that's just because they are in these contexts where they're in fragmented landscapes or within an urban forest setting. So they couldn't meet that total acreage in terms of stand size or unit size, which is why we call them affiliate versus core sites. And it's just because of the size of the units. We also have some specific monitoring guidelines. So we really are trying to compare across all of these sites by looking at overstory, midstory, and understory conditions at different time intervals. And of course, this is a climate study. So we're really thinking, how are we evaluating all of these treatments at least 20 years into the future? But then each of these sites is in its own unique forest type. The management goals and objectives are going to vary depending on the landowner context and what's going on within that forest type. The climate impacts that are affecting the different sites across the US and Canada are going to look slightly different, although most of them are dealing with some degree of drought, and there's a disturbance regime that they're all tackling. So those are some things that are pretty consistent as well. The layout's going to look different depending on slope and aspect and topography, what's going on with the soils. And so you'll see some examples of how that can look a little different on the ground. And then the tactics to actually achieve those desired future conditions are going to vary depending on what's being implemented at each forest. And then with each ASC site, there's also, it's kind of once you build it, they will come. And so there's a whole bunch of really fun monitoring questions and research questions that are now being asked at different ASC sites based on if there's someone interested in small mammal herbivory on seedlings, or what's going on with coarse woody debris. How are slime molds responding to overstory canopy conditions? And so there's a lot of really cool research and different monitoring taking place across the sites as well. And so just as a quick example, as I mentioned, that layout is going to look different depending on slope and aspect and topography. So these are just 3 quick examples of what the layout can look like on the ground, depending on what's going on within that forest type and that forest condition. And again, with that plot design, we used a typical FIA or forest inventory and analysis plot. So you've got your 5th acre plot with nested subplots, and that allows us to look at the overstory, midstory, and understory in terms of species composition, density, and diversity, different forest health indicators, as well as productivity indicators as well. So this helps us answer some of those questions of how are our forests responding to these silvicultural treatments that we're implementing on the ground. So we wanted to provide two quick examples. One that's highlighted in the paper is the Second College Grant, which is in northern New Hampshire on Dartmouth College's Second College Grant. It's a mesic northern hardwood forest that's dominated by sugar maple, yellow birch, American beech, red maple, red spruce, aspen, and balsam fir. And the starting condition was about 20 to 24 meters squared per hectare. Some of the climate concerns at this site are things like wind and ice events, moisture stress, and then native and invasive pests and diseases, which are really starting to increase in the region. And then the site leads include Tony D'Amato from the University of Vermont, Kevin Evans and Riley Patry at Dartmouth College, who are those on the ground, boots on the ground managers, really making everything happen. And then Pete Clark with the University of Vermont. And so, with resistance at the Second College Grant, what we're really trying to do is encourage that multi-age and size structure to maintain vigor, quality, and productivity levels that are consistent with northern hardwood forests. So again, we're maintaining that composition and structure of the forest. So it's just being reduced to about, through a single tree selection, to about 16 to 18 meters squared per hectare. Really trying to maintain that multi-cohort stand condition that's dominated by sugar maple, favoring trees that are resistant, have resistant crown forms, and are used to those wind and ice events, creating those gap disturbances, and then increasing the amount of deadwood for carbon sequestration. With resilience, the overarching goal is to really increase diversity of species structure combinations to provide multiple pathways of recovery from those disturbance events. So the silvicultural treatment implemented is a hybrid single tree or group selection where 20% is in gaps, 20% is in these reserves that are maintained, and then there's a matrix that's reduced down to 16 to 18 meters squared per hectare. And so with this one, we're increasing diversity by increasing the proportion of yellow birch, spruce, and red maple currently found within the stand. And then really thinking again about how can we have those combinations of species composition and structure through that series of gaps and matrices and reserves, and then increasing the proportion of some of those under represented species. And then finally, with transition, we're increasing structural complexity and dominance of both future adapted on-site and off-site species. And so they implemented that continuous cover or regular shelter wood, where again we have those gaps that are getting a little bigger, about a quarter to a full acre. And then as well as maintaining some of those reserves, and that matrix is thinned down to that 16 to 18 meters squared per hectare. And so future adapted species that are planted in transition in those gaps are northern red oak, bitternut hickory, eastern white pine, eastern hemlock, basswood, black birch, big-tooth aspen, and chestnut. And so we're really increasing that future adapted both on and off-site species composition to really see how those different species will do in the future under this increased structural complexity within this forest. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Maria, and she's going to talk about the John Prince.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. I sound good? Yep. Awesome. Great. Thanks. So the second site example we'll be covering is the John Prince Research Forest. This is collaboratively managed by the Tlosden First Nation, the Binshawootton First Nation, and the University of Northern British Columbia in a subboreal forest. The site leads are Che Elkin, Kristen Waring, and Dexter Hodder. And some of the projected climate impacts for this research forest include either a warmer and drier future condition, similar to interior Douglas fir forests, or a warmer and wetter future condition similar to interior cedar hemlock forests. So this means that there may be some climate mismatches with ecosystem components such as insect life cycles and plant phenology, and also an increased risk of drought stress, altered site hydrology, and changing fire regimes, which will all affect forest composition, health, and productivity at the site. Next slide, please. Thanks. So when we get into the treatments, looking at the RRT spectrum for this research forest, for the resistance treatment, they were looking at a modified hybrid group selection system, retaining about 15 meters squared of basal area, including those veteran trees, and aiming to reduce the amount of subalpine fir at those sites. For this one, when we're talking about planting, it's looking at planting locally sourced Douglas fir on the mesic and drier sites, with hybrid white spruce on wetter sites and other deciduous species. In terms of resilience treatments, they implemented a variable retention harvest, retaining about 10 meters squared per hectare of basal area and a variety of gap sizes from zero point 0.1 all the way up to 1 hectare gaps. For this treatment, it was thinning from below to remove ladder fuels and light thinning from above of softwoods to shift that overstory composition. And then in terms of planting, at the resilience treatment, we're thinking more about planting future adapted species, so drier source Douglas fir on those drier sites, and then also hybrid white spruce on wetter sites, and also lodgepole pine across sites. And then finally, for resilience, they wanted to promote natural regeneration of aspen in those gap openings. With the transition, the more forward-looking sites, they selected an irregular shelterwood system with a target overstory residual basal area of 5 to 8 meters squared per hectare, so lower. The leaf trees here were Douglas fir and deciduous species, and in terms of planting, they planted native and future adapted southern drier source species, so again, those Douglas fir on the drier sites, hybrid white spruce on wetter sites, and again, the lodgepole pine across all of the sites. But also here in the transition, we're looking at planting more novel species, so western red cedar, western hemlock on wet sites, and ponderosa pine, and then western larch and western white pine on those drier sites. Thanks. So as we've begun to look at cross-site trends for resistance, resilience, and transition treatments across the network, those 2 sites, but also all 12 of the other sites we have, some common themes have emerged. Across sites, uniform application of intermediate treatments or regeneration methods focused on increasing tree vigor and maintaining current compositional conditions are common cross-site themes when we're looking at resistance. And some differences emerge when analyzing sites along a moisture gradient. So the network spans a moisture gradient from semi-arid forests at the Intermountain West sites all the way to humid forests at those northeastern U.S. sites. And the management of tree density as an adaptation tactic to resist drought impacts is more prevalent at semi-arid sites. On the other hand, insect and pathogen impacts are more prevalent in eastern North America. So with the ASCC sites located in those regions, tactics to address these threats, often including regeneration harvests to restore and maintain mixed species conditions, are more common themes. Looking at resilience trends, many of the resilience treatments across the network emphasize multi-cohort silvicultural methods, and these are aimed at creating diverse resource environments, spatially complex distributions of mature trees, and a range of size and age classes. So these resilience treatments reflect that recognized importance of ecosystem complexity in generating multiple adaptation and recovery pathways. And then finally, in terms of transition treatment trends, these often devote a greater portion of the stand to regeneration of future adapted species, either through stand-wide harvests of most mature trees or through the creation of large canopy gaps, while also still continuing to integrate tactics such as the retention of mature trees as biological legacies. Next slide. Thank you. So forest-assisted migration across sites is another adaptation option that may be utilized. And just as a quick refresher, the 3 types of FAM are assisted population migration, assisted range expansion, and assisted species migration. So assisted population migration is the movement of species or genotypes relatively short distances, with the expansion occurring contiguously within the current distribution of that species or genotype. Assisted range expansion is the movement of species to suitable locations adjacent to, but currently outside of that current range, and this is most often done to keep pace with changing conditions. And then finally, assisted species migration is the assisted long-term migration of a species beyond areas currently accessible via natural dispersal boundaries. So some trends of forest-assisted migration across our ASCC sites have emerged. You can read more about this at the link provided in the slide from this great Palak et al. Paper. I'm sure we can drop it into the chat. Courtney, I think there's a little, thank you. So looking at resistance trends, because we're really maintaining that current composition, there's a limited FAM used here, and when used, it's focused on maintaining the current composition. As we start to look more on the spectrum towards facilitating and promoting change, looking at resilience treatment trends, this is where sites may incorporate assisted population expansion, though there's still limited assisted range expansion used. And then finally, transition sites or treatments where we're really intentionally facilitating change. This sites are heavily incorporating assisted population expansion and range expansion, and there may include some limited examples of assisted species migration. And then in terms of adaptation planting goals as a whole across the spectrum, this is a figure from P. Clark, which highlights various goals that sites may aim for across the RRT spectrum. And oh, thank you for dropping that in the chat, Maria. So some of the goals are really common across all of the treatments, such as reforestation to meet or increase stocking, the support of non-tree biodiversity, and then carbon mitigation. And then some planting goals across RRT are more common to resistance and a little bit of resilience, including the enrichment of native species or genotypes, the maintenance or restoration of specific ecological functions, and the restoration of ecological or cultural keystone species. As we start to again look more towards that forward-looking promoting change goals in the resilience and transition treatments, here we're seeing goals such as increasing tree compositional and genetic diversity, increasing stand structural complexity, functional trait redundancy, and then again, we're starting to see more use of FAM, so assisted population migration, range expansion, and then some of the transition treatments, assisted species migration. Thank you. So, getting back to some of the adaptation trends we've seen across sites, consistent consideration of the historic range of variability in determining and developing those desired future conditions in silvicultural tactics in the context of a changing climate is really the key here. So we project a range of future conditions, and this leads to a range of adaptation options spanning the resistance, resilience, and transition spectrum. As a result, common themes of species diversity, complexity, structural complexity, emphasis on regeneration, and multi-age silviculture, and an increase in planting of future adapted or novel species and use of force-assisted migration really start to emerge across network sites. Lots of animation. Thank you. And so, as we look toward the broader application of ASK principles, some of the key considerations that we noted come from our bioscience paper. And these core principles really come from over a decade of experience conceiving, establishing, and maintaining the ASK experimental framework from the great people here leading today that have been with ASK the whole way. So, one of the first is co-producing science with local managers, scientists, and community partners to leverage that place-based knowledge. This one really entails engaging local and regional forest managers, scientists, indigenous knowledge holders, and policymakers in the early planning stages to ensure experimental relevance to local ecosystems, ownerships, vulnerabilities, and management practices. The next is the use of that resistance, resilience, and transition gradient to continue to communicate and assess how adaptation actions vary in their effects on forests. So the RRT spectrum is a flexible framework used to clarify our action and intent, and this can be applied within various ecosystems and regions and globally. The next principle is ensuring that treatments are feasible and representative of operational scales. Experiments are most effective when they match the scale and practical constraints of real-world regional forest management practices, ensuring that results are both realistic and actionable within typical economic and operational limits. The next principle is determining baselines and establishing benchmarks for change. So prior to treatment, establishing a clear understanding of site-level baselines and identifying potential thresholds for change is foundational to all future analyses, decisions, and even basic communication of our experiment and intent. The next is the use of desired future conditions as thresholds for success. So DFCs provide tangible benchmarks for forest character and function over time, including explicit targets for characteristics such as species and genetic composition, structure, function, and ecosystem services. And articulating these desired future conditions early on help us to guide the treatment development and other key decisions over time. Finally, incorporating climate novelty and testing extreme scenarios. In addition to testing more conservative management scenarios, the experimental nature of our work encourages actions that move beyond historic practices in designing treatments that test responses to more novel or extreme futures. Another principle is that we want to plan for flexible management and communication to build capacity and foster knowledge exchange. This is the importance of building in processes and mechanisms for iterative adjustments in management, and ensuring our findings are communicated effectively to both scientific and practitioner audiences. Thank you. So we've got a lot going on. Some of what's on the horizon that we've listed here, just some of the things we're looking towards in the next year. One is really an emphasis on cross-site research. As we've got 14 sites, we have two ORISE fellows, we've got an adaptation planting work group, we can really begin to synthesize those cross-site findings. We've also been launching a network metadata project where we're looking at what sites are collecting, both the key variables that everyone's collecting, but also some of the wildlife research or deadwood research, bug and bird research that different sites are collecting. We've also started an adaptation planting work group led by Pete Clark, and we've got some really exciting findings coming from that, just further applying those principles I provided on the adaptation and planting goals slide. We're also analyzing carbon storage across treatments and sites. Again, our ORISE fellows are on the call, so if you've got questions about network metadata or carbon storage, feel free to direct those to them too. Our collaborators at UMN have been leading a tribal engagement study across the ASC sites, including several key ASC sites where they've been conducting really focused interviews with tribal community members and also the ASC site leads. And then we've got a ton of great communications work. I'm not sure if Riley's on the call, but our amazing Ask intern from last year launched an Ask podcast called Asking the Experts. We've also sent out Ask newsletters, this webinar, hosting an Ask Chats seminar once a month, and then also we revamped our website so that we can start posting communications more frequently there. And then most importantly, of course, is continuing work with governance and future network development so that we can continue to do this awesome work into the future with all these amazing collaborators. So really looking towards how do we keep our Ask longevity and governance going into the future. Some of the Ask impacts, so just a few key things before we start to get towards questions. We're the largest experimental silvicultural program focused on climate adaptation in the US and Canada. Again, we've got 14 statistically robust operational and experimental sites. We also have over 12 years of existing data at our oldest site, the Cutfoot. We've engaged over 500 natural resource professionals who have been directly trained in applying climate adaptive silviculture using our Ask site examples through the National Advanced Silviculture Program. We also have over 200 management and scientist collaborators who are sharing lessons learned from Ask. As we begin to collect more data, I honestly think this number is going to explode when we realize that it's how many people truly have been impacted or worked with Ask. And the RRT framework approach directly informs large-scale land management policies implementation. So everything from doing really directed projects at various climate adaptation workshops all the way up to adaptation guidance for NEPA. Thank you, and I'm really excited to open it up to questions and hear from all of you.
Well, as I knew it would be, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you all. Um, it's really inspiring how you as a team have persevered over a long time, um, produced great materials, and I was struck in the presentation. You have just good photos, good diagrams. It really made me feel like I got to raise my level to keep up with you all. But let's hear from our participants. We got about 36 folks online here, so you can unmute. I think we have few enough people that you can just go ahead and unmute yourselves and ask a question, or feel free to ask it in the chat here. And I know some of you, so be warned. I may call you out for questions, Carrie or Christopher or Colin. There are three folks in a row I know. Um, so I guess. Oh wait, here. Oh, Christopher unmuted. Okay, Christopher, you have a question or comment?
I do have a question. I'm wondering if silvicultural research like this with the climate change focus is going on in other regions of the world and what that might look like.
Linda, do you want to take that one?
I'll maybe go first. Yes, in my experience and interactions, Christopher, that's definitely happening. And just anecdotally, responses to this particular project has been really interesting to field inquiries about the work that we're doing. there's certain, like Europe has a number of efforts underway, and Ask has served a little bit as, I would say, inspiration and a framework for thinking about how others might try to conduct research that is meaningful and presents, a sort of spectrum of ways to think about how to think about climate change. But we fielded a lot of questions and inquiries from lots of corners of the globe, and we talk about this being an international network, and as you know, we have 2 sites in Canada. The rest of them are in the United States, and there's complementary types of work that are happening that are not part of the network, but that we continue to kind of engage with. So I don't know if anyone else wants to address that question, but yes, there's definitely climate change work going on.
Yeah, the only other one I'd mention is we've been talking a lot with the diverse team out of Canada. And so they're also implementing a large scale silvicultural experiment across Canada, but it's really focused on forest operators, and the like timber production side, but they're thinking about it from that climate perspective and including assisted migration within what they want to do as well, which is really exciting. And so that's another example of one of these larger scale silvicultural networks and experiments that's taken off across Canada.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question, Christopher. I'll go ahead and ask a question while we're waiting for other folks to type in or unmute. I was curious of the existing sites and have there been a number of examples of disturbances or rapid changes that have hit sort of existing experiments? I'm thinking of, a blowdown or, a wildfire coming through that wasn't planned.
Hurricane Michael went through the Jones Center at Itchaway site in Georgia. And so that's that longleaf pine dominated site. And yeah, so there's a paper, I think, led by Seth Bigelow and Chris Looney that looked at some of the responses. But really, the resilience treatment, I think, as a quick snapshot, was the one that did really well with that big blowdown hurricane wind event. It also varied a little bit depending on where you're located within the Jones Center. So there's an area that's right next to an ag production. And so that set of resistance resilience transition treatments all got hit a little bit harder and experienced more blowdown across those stands because the wind picked up across that field before hitting those treatments compared to other parts of the Jones Center at Itchaway, which were a little bit more sheltered by the existing canopy conditions across the center. So, but that one did experience that hurricane. We had a tiny fire start within the San Juan National Forest site, but it was like instantly put out. So we did not experience fire through those treatments yet.
Great. And Maria added the link. Thank you. So Quinn asked what the minimum acreage needed to be an affiliate site is.
Yeah. Courtney, I'm going to ask if there's a minimum, but then I'm going to kind of build on that in terms of some of the other opportunities if people are thinking, I want an Ask site.
Yeah, I don't think we really have a minimum for affiliates because it depends on the context. So within like the Crosby Farm site within the middle of the Twin Cities, it's in an urban park. And so it's, Linda, what is the size? Are they 10th hectare plots?
Yeah,
I
I
think
think that sounds right.
So they're really small because it's like these little
Right.
plots within an urban setting. So it just depends on the context.
Yeah. And so we'll say, like, if folks are like I said, if folks are like, I want an Ask site, I guess I'll provide a little bit of context there too. We're still kind of trying to figure out, because we had a really big growth period. I mean, I guess to start at the beginning, we set out with a pilot to, come up with prescriptions for 3 to 5 sites and not even necessarily to implement. That was sort of the seed funding we initially received from the Forest Service. And then we've just been really successful in having partners and a core team of folks who've been able to develop sites. And so we had a really large increase in the number of sites through about 2020, 2022. And then, we've been taking a pause on establishing new sites to make sure that we have just a really good network structure and kind of get those nuts and bolts in terms of making sure that we are built to last, because it's sort of you're going from like startup mode into something that you want to be a long-term experiment. So we've received Forest Service funding. We're really fortunate a few years to receive that, and that's been really helping us bolster those efforts and move into this implementation phase. And so right now we are not necessarily developing new sites. We're kind of having the conversation of how would we do that, and I think a big part would be thinking about bringing in attributes that aren't already represented by the network and are complementary to the existing pool of sites. But for folks who are really interested in having an adaptation demonstration site or bringing a research component into their adaptation work, we do have the ability to do some of that. And so, for instance, our team at the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and Northern Forest Climate Hub, and then working with some of the other regional climate hubs, have supported a wide variety of partners in terms of developing adaptation demonstrations. So these are real world projects where people use the adaptation workbook and go through it, but it's just like, I'm doing it for my land. And then we've also been collaborating with more and more people, researchers who are thinking about kind of bringing in these components of resistance, resilience, transition, but not at necessarily the level of the full ask replication and commitment, which is really substantial. And so we are collecting up sort of research demonstrations and complementary studies and thinking about how to partner with those. And so there are a number of folks, including there are more than I know of, but Julia Burton at Michigan Tech and has some sites at SUNY. Tony D'Amato has sites in the Northeast. And there are some sites in Ontario. So there are a few of these that are kind of smaller versions of experimental designs that maybe have some resilience and some transition treatments and are studies with replication, but aren't at the scale of replication and the size of treatment. So folks have those questions, they can send them our way, and we can kind of help direct people to the kind of the right size of demonstration or project that might be of interest to them. We'll see if anyone else on the team wants to add to that.
That's great. Sounds like there are a lot of options for getting involved. And I know I've seen a number of projects that have just used the approach, not so much for generating new science, but saying, hey, these are good approaches. Let's just put them into action. So there's that option too. I want to call out Brad Hutnick's question on RRT versus the RAD. And Courtney already put in a nice link to another paper that kind of builds this out. But I don't know if anybody on the team wanted to just verbally kind of touch on that.
Yeah, I'll touch on it. And thanks, Courtney. I forgot about that citation. I'll touch on it since I'm a co-author on that paper and probably end up fielding this question. So for folks who aren't aware, there are these different adaptation frameworks that are out there. And this involves adaptation, I would say planning processes. So like the adaptation workbook, there's a um, climate smart planning cycle. There's a couple others, as well as some of these conceptual frameworks for adaptation. So we use the resistance resilience transition framework, which is based off of a paper going back to 2007 by Connie Millar that we found incredibly insightful as we were getting all of our adaptation work going. That kind of sets up this idea of what trajectory do you want to go? Where do you want to end up? Like where are you trying to go in the long run in terms of like what that desired future condition will be? There's also a framework, and it's much more it's more prevalent, I would say, in the Western US. It's a little more prevalent in wildlife or Department of Interior sort of spaces, I would say, in the management community, called Resist, Accept, Direct. It's made by really phenomenal adaptations and climate scientists in the Park Service and USGS. And that one is thinking, I think, less, I would say that as foresters, like resistance resilience transition works for foresters because we have this conception of desired future conditions. So like, what is the condition we're trying to get to and how do we get there? I think resist, accept, direct has a lot of overlap, but it sort of thinks about what is the action that we're taking at this point in time? Are we resisting, accepting, or directing? And then like 10 years in the future, are we resisting, accepting, and directing? We have articulated both in some of our other documents. So Brad or others, if you actually want the terminology on how to kind of explain these, I can help out. They're not one-to-one. I think they're really useful in their place. And I would say that like both of them are just conceptual frameworks and they're going to work for some organizations better than others. And so really the idea is just figure out like which one is going to work for the group that you work with. And this Miller paper that was mentioned really points to the fact of like, they're all kind of interchangeable. And we've used resist, accept, direct with adaptation workbook and it's fine. So if you find a group that's using one over the other, go for it. Just keep moving.
Don't get hung up in the semantics is what I'm hearing. Uh, so Rowan has an interesting question that you can read, but I'll read out here. Um, Within treatments that involve increased FAM and particularly more assisted species migration, have there been trends of high seedling mortality? Have there been follow-up interventions to encourage tree cover if the initial plantings had high mortality rates? And how does that change the buy-in from local stakeholders?
I can field that question. Great question. And I'm going to use just one site example because we've got about 8 to 10 year data on the northern Minnesota Cutfoot experimental forest site. So we actually have some meaningful response at this point in time. And one thing to keep in mind, we're planting climate adaptive species and the climate is changing. It's changing relatively quickly, but it's still, it's changing. And so we're planting, we planted a suite of species on that particular site. And so we have 8 year results that are about to be submitted for publication. And we planted ponderosa pine in northern Minnesota. And most of you on this call probably recognize that that might be out of its geographic range. But it was a species to potentially replace red pine should red pine become extremely vulnerable. And so the ponderosa pine that has survived is growing pretty well, but its survival rate is now quite low on that site. And Eastern white pine is doing better than ponderosa pine on that particular site. So that's a native species. And then there's been higher survival for the hardwood species versus pine species. And the native hardwoods are doing better than the novel hardwoods, the sort of out of range hardwoods that have been planted there. So that's insightful for us to continue tracking that. We planted a lot of species, so we're not super concerned about the impact on regeneration or the impact on forest structure at this point into the future. But it is a question that, of course, one would want to be paying attention to if this was your primary way of managing that particular forest. So hopefully that's a little bit insightful to one site. And it hasn't affected buy-in because it's an experiment, right? And people are just really interested to see how are things performing right now under those different silvicultural treatments.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Maybe this is a good question to end on, but Scott asks about surprises over the last 10 years and particularly successful tactics or maybe tactics that were particularly unsuccessful.
Linda, you can add on to this one too. But I think one thing we're starting to see more of as we've had newer sites joined the network up to 2022 was interest in those irregular shelter wood systems. And so that is definitely one that I think has been nice to see utilized more as a tool to really expand the silvicultural toolbox across ecosystems in the West and the East.
Cool.
And so, yeah, really playing with that structural heterogeneity with that irregular silvicultural system. And then there's also been, like, there's some sites where resistance is like, why would we do this? And so there's a lot of hesitancy around trying to maintain the current structure when we're thinking about climate change. And so I think that's one where we have to have a lot of conversations around this is why we need to have a resistance treatment. Whereas now there's more acceptance around transition and doing things like forest assisted migration. And it's easier to have those conversations around what genetic variations and what species provide the functional traits but are future adapted that we want to include in what we're planting. And so it's interesting to see how that has shifted over time.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah,
Anybody else want to add in? Oh, Linda.
yeah, that's a great answer, Courtney. And I would say that that's been appealing to people because I think they can see those multiple pathways into the future. So
Mm,
it allows them flexibility and decision making 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. And so you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, you're creating these multiple potential pathways. So
yeah, neat. Well, we should wrap here. We're at the top of the hour. I want to thank our presenters again. Excellent job. It's really inspiring. Climate change can be a heavy weight, and it's just neat to see such motivated, intelligent folks tackling the issue. So thank you. And glad to have everybody on the call today, all the participants. We'll put this out on our YouTube channel, and I'll follow up with all registrants with a link to that in case you want to share it with your colleagues. So thanks so much and look forward to catching you in meetings or events or on other webinars. So thanks, everybody.
thanks, Xander.
Thank you.